Okay, so imagine you're 22 years old, right? And you're leading this group of soldiers,
Oh, wow.
and you're facing down an enemy that you know has way more people than you, way better weapons than you.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Oh, man, that's...
That was George Washington at the Battle of Fort Necessity. Talk about a trial by fire.
Wow.
You guys asked us for a deep dive on the early life of this American icon.
Yeah,
And we're going to separate the man from the myth here.
absolutely. It's really interesting how much those early experiences of George Washington, the years before the Revolution, really shaped his character, his leadership style.
Yeah.
We've got some great excerpts here from the History That Doesn't Suck podcast.
Oh, I love that podcast.
Yeah, it's really great.
And you know me, I love those little details that really bring history to life.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's just forget about that whole cherry tree thing, all right?
Okay.
Washington's childhood was not an idyllic sort of upbringing.
No, not at all. He wasn't born into privilege like some of his contemporaries were. Yeah. He was what they would call lower gentry.
Okay.
And so, always aware of his social standing. And then he loses his father at a young age,
Yeah.
which really shifted the dynamic in the family.
And the podcast paints a really interesting picture of his mother, Mary Ball Washington.
Yeah.
She sounds like a very strong-willed person.
Yeah. She's described as austere and unbending, even.
Wow.
Yeah. So, can you imagine the impact that must have had on young George?
Yeah. I mean, that's a strong personality to deal with.
Intense.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you can really see how that impacted his drive and his ambition.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he clearly craved her approval.
Yeah.
But it seems like she was pretty tough, you know?
Yeah.
And her disapproval actually had a big impact on his decisions.
Really?
Even his career aspirations.
He wanted to join the Navy.
Can you imagine?
Can you imagine George Washington out there on the high seas?
Yeah, I know. It's like,
Amazing.
I mean, that's a whole
Completely
different
different.
picture of him. But
The mom put the kibosh on that one. Yeah, she did.
and those dreams were sunk.
Yeah. So instead, at 16, he finds himself surveying the Virginia wilderness,
Okay,
which was no walk in the park.
I can imagine.
You're talking dense forests, rattlesnakes,
Oh, wow.
unpredictable weather. It was a really demanding job.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think you can see how these experiences might have shaped him and given him that grit and determination he's known for.
Yeah.
But I think it was his relationship with his older half-brother Lawrence that really sets him on a different course.
Oh, tell me about that.
So Lawrence becomes this mentor figure to him
Okay.
and really introduces him to this whole world of the wealthy and powerful.
Okay.
He even takes him on a trip to Barbados.
Nice.
But this isn't a vacation, no lounging on the beach.
Right.
Lawrence was actually seeking treatment for tuberculosis,
Oh, wow.
but inadvertently they exposed George to smallpox.
Oh.
Yeah, and this is where I think fate takes a really interesting turn.
Okay.
So George gets smallpox,
Wait a
but he
minute.
survives and gains lifelong immunity.
That's amazing.
I know it's a seemingly random event, right? But it's going to prove crucial during his military career.
Oh, wow.
Because smallpox outbreaks just decimated armies back then.
It's like one of those little moments that you just don't realize is going to have a huge impact
Right.
down the road
Exactly.
on the course of history.
Yeah. And then tragedy strikes a few years later when Lawrence dies.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And it obviously deeply affects George, but it also opens up some doors for him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's this real double-edged sword, right?
Okay.
He inherits Mount Vernon,
Okay.
his beloved estate,
Yeah.
and he gains access to all these powerful connections through Lawrence's widow's family, the Fairfaxes.
The Fairfaxes.
Yeah.
That was a big name in Virginia back then.
Oh, yeah, they were huge. They had these ties to the British elite,
Wow.
and they actually helped George secure a military commission.
I mean, it's amazing he didn't have any formal training.
Yep.
But it sounds like his social connections and the reputation he built as a surveyor really helped him out.
Oh, yeah, for sure. You could say that's where ambition meets opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then this is where he really steps onto the world stage, right?
Yeah.
As global tensions between France and Britain are starting to spill over into the Ohio Valley.
The French and Indian War is brewing.
And the Ohio Valley is basically ground zero.
It was a flashpoint.
Yeah.
Both sides recognized how strategically important it was
Yeah.
for trade and just control of this vast North American interior.
So young Major Washington is sent on a mission to warn the French.
Yeah, basically deliver a message saying, hey, you guys need to get out of here.
It sounds like a really high-stakes game of diplomatic poker.
It was, and it really exposed him to this complex web of indigenous alliances.
Okay.
I mean, you've got Native American tribes playing pivotal roles on both sides of this conflict.
The podcast really does a good job of describing this really tense encounter with the Seneca leader, Canagrison, also known as the Half King.
Yeah. Tanacharson was a really shrewd strategist. I mean, he's playing the British and the French against each other to advance the interests of his people.
That's smart.
Yeah, he was no fool.
So he forms an alliance with Washington.
Yeah, he saw Washington as a potential ally
Okay.
in their struggle against the French.
And then things really escalate
They do.
with the Jumonville Glen skirmish.
Yeah, and this is where you see Washington's inexperience, maybe even his ambition, get the better of him.
Oh,
It's a surprise attack on a small French detachment,
wow.
orchestrated with Tanacharson's help.
And the podcast doesn't hold back when it comes to the brutality of what happened.
Oh, it doesn't.
They describe Tanacharson's actions towards the French leader as particularly gruesome.
It's a stark reminder of just the different cultural perspectives back then and the brutal realities of warfare in that era.
And this incident, while small in scale, had far-reaching consequences.
It is set the stage for a much larger conflict.
And then we get to Fort Necessity, right? Washington, anticipating French retaliation, builds this hastily constructed fort.
It was a desperate attempt to hold ground against this superior force.
And the location was not ideal.
It wasn't, no.
And then the battle itself was just a disaster for the British.
Yeah, dwindling supplies, torrential rain, relentless French assault.
The podcast describes the conditions inside the fort as just absolutely miserable.
Oh, yeah.
Soaked, demoralized,
Yeah.
resorting to rum just to cope.
Yeah. They were not having a good time.
Not a good time at all.
No. So outnumbered and outgunned.
Washington's forced to surrender.
He is.
And then this is where things get really interesting.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about it.
The surrender document that he signs has a mistranslation.
Oh, no.
And it inadvertently labels him as an assassin.
Oh, wow. Imagine the weight of that unintended confession, especially for a guy who is so concerned with honor and reputation.
A 22-year-old guy thrust into command accidentally confesses to murder.
Yeah.
Talk about a bad day at the office.
Yeah, and this seemingly minor blunder sets the stage for this huge conflict that becomes the French and Indian War.
Wow.
What started as a skirmish in the Ohio Valley is now escalating into a global war with huge consequences.
So we have this young, ambitious, somewhat blundering George Washington at the center of all this chaos.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see how these early experiences really shaped the leader he would become.
It's a good reminder that history is messy.
It is.
It's nuanced.
No.
There are rarely these clear-cut heroes and villains.
That's right.
It's all about perspective.
Exactly, and interpretation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is just the beginning of the French and Indian War. I mean, this conflict is going to rage on for years, and Washington is going to be right in the thick of it.
Okay.
Several major battles.
We're going to get into that in the next part of our deep dive.
We are.
We're going to explore the fallout from Fort Necessity, Washington's evolving reputation, and really what the lasting impact of the French and Indian War was on the American colonies.
Yeah, the consequences were huge.
Yeah, it's going to be good.
Can't wait.
All right, catch you next time.
Sounds good. You know, it's amazing to think about how that one event, the surrender at Fort Necessity, really reverberated across the Atlantic.
Oh, yeah?
You can just imagine the headlines in London, colonial major blunders into war.
Yeah, I don't think the British were too happy with Washington's performance.
Not really.
They kind of saw him as this inexperienced amateur
Right.
who just stumbled into this major conflict.
Yeah. I mean, in Europe, he was seen as kind of a cautionary tale of colonial ambition gone wrong. But back in the colonies, it was a whole different story.
Because over here, they saw him as somebody who stood up to the French, defended British interests,
Yeah.
even if it didn't go exactly according to plan.
Exactly. There was this sense of pride in his actions.
Okay.
You know, this feeling that he had shown real courage
Okay.
in the face of overwhelming odds.
I mean, I'm sure not everybody agreed with what he did.
Of course not.
I'm sure some people were questioning his judgment.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But overall, he comes out of this experience with a much higher profile.
He does, yeah, both positive and negative.
So you have two very different narratives coming out of the same event.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how Washington himself processed all of this.
It must have been tough for him.
I mean, he was so young.
Yeah.
And so concerned with his honor and his reputation.
Definitely grappling with the unintended consequences of his actions.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, he's being held up as the symbol of colonial defiance.
I mean, just the weight of that mistranslation.
Yeah,
The accidental confession of assassination.
it must have weighed heavily on him.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's just a good reminder that history is messy.
it is.
It's nuanced.
Yeah, and there are rarely clear-cut heroes and villains.
Right. It's all about perspective
Exactly.
and how we interpret things.
And I think it's also important to remember that this was just the beginning of the French and Indian War.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, this conflict is going to drag on for years.
Wow.
And Washington's going to play a key role in several major battles.
The podcast mentioned one in particular.
Yeah.
A really disastrous engagement.
Yeah, led by General Edward Braddock.
He was a seasoned British commander,
Yeah.
but maybe a little overconfident in his abilities.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
So Braddock's defeat at the Monongahela was a turning point in the war.
It was.
His forces were just decimated
They were.
by this combined force of French and Native American troops.
It was humiliating
Yeah.
for the British and really a stark reminder of how difficult it was.
To fight in the North American wilderness.
Yeah, the terrain was brutal.
But this is where Washington steps up,
He
right?
does.
Even though he's wounded himself,
Yeah.
he takes charge, he organizes this retreat,
Mm-hmm.
and prevents the complete destruction of the British forces.
Yeah, it's a moment that really showcases his leadership potential.
Yeah.
You see his ability to stay calm under pressure
Mm.
and inspire the men around him.
So even in this defeat, he's earning the respect of his men
He is.
and starting to really build this reputation
Yeah.
as a capable military leader.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we're starting to see glimpses of the general
Oh, yeah.
who will one day lead the Continental Army.
But the French and Indian War was about so much more than just these individual battles and heroic feats.
It was.
What about the bigger picture here?
Right. Well, the podcast does a really good job of highlighting the broader consequences of this conflict.
Okay.
And I think one of the most significant outcomes was this massive territorial shift.
Okay.
I mean, France is basically driven out of North America.
No.
They lose all of their mainland territory to Great Britain.
It completely reshaped the map of the continent,
It did.
and Great Britain emerges as the dominant power in North America.
Yeah, they do.
But this victory came at a steep price.
Yeah, you're talking about the debt. The enormous debt that the British incurred during the war.
And this is something that often gets overlooked, but it's so important
It is.
to understanding how we get to the American Revolution.
Absolutely.
Because to pay off this debt, the British government decided to impose taxes on the colonies. And that did not go over very well.
Not at all.
I mean, a lot of these colonies had fought and bled alongside British troops,
Yeah.
and they resented being asked to shoulder the financial burden of a war.
Yeah, they increasingly saw it as benefiting the mother country
Yeah.
more than it benefited them.
And it wasn't just about the money.
No.
The podcast talked about how the British started stationing troops in the colonies,
Yeah.
supposedly to protect them from Native American uprisings.
Right, on paper, it sounds like a good idea,
Yeah,
but it backfired.
big time.
Yeah, instead of feeling protected,
Yeah.
the colonists felt occupied.
Oh, wow.
I mean, you've got these troops often quartered in private homes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it just fueled resentment.
Yeah, and further eroded trust in the British government.
Yeah, this was a major turning point
Wow.
in the relationship between the colonies and the crown.
So the French and Indian War, this conflict that was sparked in part by Washington's actions at Jumonville Glen and for a necessity,
Mhm.
inadvertently sets the stage for the American Revolution.
It's like this chain reaction
Yeah.
with each event leading to the next.
And through all of this, Washington's reputation just keeps evolving.
It does, yeah. In the colonies, he's increasingly seen as this symbol of strength
Yeah.
and defiance, someone who really understands the challenges
Yeah.
that they're facing.
And isn't afraid to stand up for their interests.
Yeah.
So we're not just seeing the emergence of a military leader.
Right.
They're also a potential political figurehead.
Someone who really embodies that growing sense of colonial identity
Yeah.
and the desire for greater autonomy.
The seeds of revolution are being sown.
They are.
And Washington, shaped by the crucible of war and the complex dynamics of colonial politics, is right there in the middle of it all.
Yeah, it's incredible to think about how all of those early experiences, the mistakes, the miscalculations, the hard-won lessons, they all prepared him for the challenges that lay ahead.
It's really incredible when you think about it. All of those early experiences in the Ohio Valley, facing down the French, navigating those really complex alliances with Native American tribes. Those were all these formative moments
Yeah.
for the leader Washington would eventually become.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it wasn't just about military tactics and strategies.
Okay.
It was about really understanding human nature, how to build relationships,
Yeah.
and learning how to make tough decisions, with limited information. And that's something that applies to everyone. It transcends time and profession.
It's just fascinating to me how this deep dive has shown this totally different side of George Washington.
Yeah.
We all have this image of him in our minds, right?
Right.
This stoic, almost mythical figure.
Yeah.
But he was a real person,
He was.
making mistakes, grappling with doubts, constantly evolving.
That's what makes history so interesting. It's
Yeah.
not just dates and battles.
Right.
It's the human stories, the
Yeah.
motivations, the triumphs and failures. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And it's through those individual stories that we can really get a better understanding of all those forces that have shaped our world.
I agree.
So from all of this, what stands out to you as the most significant takeaway?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think for me it's just the importance of being adaptable.
Okay.
Washington faced so many unexpected challenges.
He did?
From navigating the wilderness as a young surveyor to confronting that superior enemy force at Fort Necessity.
Mm-hmm.
He was constantly having to adjust his plans,
Yeah.
learn from his mistakes and find new ways to achieve his goals.
It's interesting you say that because I was thinking about his resilience.
Yeah.
He suffered some serious setbacks. He faced criticism,
Yeah.
even that humiliating defeat at Fort Necessity.
Oh, yeah.
But he never gave up.
It's true. He picked himself up, dusted himself off, learned from those experiences, honed his skills, and ultimately became this leader who was capable of uniting a nation
Yeah,
that speaks to his character,
it does.
this unwavering belief in himself and his vision for America.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the early life of George Washington,
Yeah.
I'm left with this one thought. How did those formative experiences, the challenges he faced,
Yeah.
the decisions he made, contribute to the leader he would become?
It's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, and what can we learn from his mistakes?
Right.
As well as his triumphs?
What can we take away from all of this and apply to our own lives?
Those are excellent questions to think about. And that's the beauty of history, right?
Yeah.
It's not just a collection of facts and figures.
No, it's not.
It's a source of inspiration,
Mhm.
a guidebook for navigating life's complexities,
Yeah.
and just a reminder that even the greatest leaders
Mm-hmm.
were once ordinary people.
Who dared to dream big and to persevere in the face of adversity.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive.
Sounds good.
Hope you guys enjoyed this conversation.
Me too.
We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into history.
Take care.